Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to a look at the second realignment in American history, which really took place over 2-3 elections, and its backdrop is the American Civil War and its immediate aftermath. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans managed to win the election of 1860, as we all remember, which angered the South enough for them to decide to secede from the Union. This led to a civil war. This led to a civil war where Lincoln and the North sought to restore the Union and eventually coalesced around the idea of abolition. The South eventually lost after a bloody conflict that to this day remains a war that claimed the most American lives. The election of 1860 was controversial to Southerners as Lincoln won the Electoral College despite not getting a single Southern vote. This, in their minds, was proof that the North sought to bully them and force them to abide by Northern ideas. And the planter class in the South thought the Republican Party was bent on abolition. And while there were Republicans pushing this position in 1860, the mainstream of the Republican Party was not in favor of abolition. They just didn't want to see slavery expanded into the territories, but allow the South to maintain it. However, by the end of the Civil War, abolition was front and center among Republican positions, and they passed 3 amendments which ensured that it would never happen again. This misunderstanding caused Southern aristocrats to call for state conventions and debate secession. 11 states did eventually secede, those being Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. During the American Civil War, the Republican Party became more and more the party of abolition and civil rights. Most in this faction would become known as radical Republicans, despite the position and the ideals becoming more mainstream, and by the end of the war being the main position of the party. Democrats were either becoming Republican or were completely unviable in elections nationally due to the connection with the South and the leniency towards the South in the aftermath of the war. And this continues on into the third-party system, which we'll discuss next week. This led to a situation where President Andrew Johnson, who was a Democratic senator from Tennessee before the war and later a military governor, he was elected vice president for Republican Abraham Lincoln in 1864, one of the first election of this realignment, the first true election of the realignment, along with 1860. He fought hard against radical Republicans, pushing for harsher punishments for the South and for a more radical form of Reconstruction, whereas Johnson wanted a much easier road. Lincoln, had he lived, probably would have been somewhere in between. This led to the first instance of impeachment, where Congress passed a bill and overrode the veto, called the Tenure in Office Act. The bill required that the president seek congressional consent and advice before removing a cabinet member or federal official who had required the consent of the Senate in order to gain the appointment. During the insanity following the attempted dismissal of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Johnson violated this law. Johnson had 11 articles of impeachment brought up against him. Most detailed his violation to the Tenure in Office Act, though one spoke specifically about his feuds with Congress through public campaign speeches and consistent vetoing of congressional bills. The Senate eventually voted on 3 articles, but all 3 came 1 vote shy of a guilty verdict and therefore 1 vote short of removal from office. Some of the Republican senators voted against as they felt the proceedings of the trial unfair due to a biased presentation of evidence, and some for unknown reasons. All Democrats in the Senate voted against removal from office. One can only speculate. However, I personally feel that most of the ones who voted against impeachment held the opinion that the proceedings were Congress attempting to remove a president whom they merely disliked and disagreed with on one key issue, this being Reconstruction. The primary issue of the elections of 1864 and 1868 was Reconstruction and civil rights. This realignment also saw the inclusion of a new group, African Americans. Because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they gained the right to vote as well as citizenship. This endeared them to the Republican Party for a long time. Very few issues mattered at the national level during these two elections, and a few afterwards. This period served as a transition between the primarily Democratic antebellum period and the post-war Republican era, mostly due to Democrats being associated with the South and secession. Now, looking at the map, this is a little bit weird and a little bit skewed, as we all know that most of the people who would be able to vote in most years in the South, specifically Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, and Florida, would have voted Democrat, along with Virginia, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and Texas, not Tennessee. Tennessee's over here. However, due to the way the states were being reconstructed, those states were voting primarily Republican because of a lot of soldiers living there, and when I say soldiers, we're talking about Union soldiers, and some laws that prevented former Confederates from voting, at least until they agreed not to take up arms against the U.S. ever again. New York was a swing state, as were to a degree Maryland and some of these New England states like Connecticut. Oregon, California, and Nevada also were somewhat swingy at the time. West Virginia started off as fairly Republican because of reasons, but eventually they swung to the Democrats, and we'll talk about that next week as well. The reason the map looks like this is because, well, we're talking about states that didn't vote in either of the two elections that are primarily covered, those being Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas. I just wanted to give a map so that people could actually see what the elections here would have looked like. New York voted Democratic in 68, but Republican in 64. Maryland, the same thing, but Maryland was more heavily Democrat. New York was a true swing state. Oregon was the same thing as the other two. Of course, none of the Confederate states voted in 1864, though you will occasionally erroneously see a few places that will cite that Louisiana held a vote and sent electors. They didn't. They were occupied, as were a lot of places along the Mississippi and starting down into Georgia. Thank you, General Sherman. I'm only being slightly sarcastic there. Yes, it was necessary to occupy the state. It wasn't necessary to burn it to the ground. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day. Bye.